Next, Mr. Birdsall will share his talk, Unwanted Companions, the Olympics and Politics.
All right, before we begin, we're a little slow maybe from lunch, so we'll get up just and do some standing exercises here quickly. Stand up if you watched the Olympics this summer. Remain standing if you can name 3 Olympians outside NBA players and Michael Phelps. How about 5 Olympians? Including winter, sure. Okay. Remain standing if you've ever DVR'd the Olympics. And actually watched it later. Are you still watching it now? Remain standing if you're still watching the Olympics now, months later. No one's standing. Ties into my talk here. I've always loved the Olympic Games. Growing up in South Jersey, we recorded hours and hours of coverage on VCR tapes of the 1988 Games in Calgary and Seoul. And I watched those tapes over and over again, getting up early on weekends to watch reruns of the Games months later. I can still remember the names of those athletes: Alberta Tomba, Katarina Witt, Greg Louganis, Carl Lewis, Florence Griffin Joyner, they called her FloJo. And I wasn't just watching the popular sports. I was watching the fencing. I was watching women's figure skating, which really wasn't cool for a 5th grader to be getting up early to watch that. I would watch the archery, the rifle shooting, all that stuff. And looking back now, I can see that my love for the Olympics really sparked a love of history for me. I've learned so much history from the Olympics in many ways. I've learned about fascism. I've learned about the Cold War. Learned about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Learned that there were, in fact, 2 Chinas at one point fighting over the right to be called China. Learned about the apartheid in South Africa and civil rights here in America. And I'd like to spend a few minutes today talking about that close intersection between the Olympics and politics. The great irony here is that the Olympic movement began with the hopes of spreading peace and friendship among nations. I would argue in my talk today that conflicts have actually increased over the years as a result of the Olympic Games. This, of course, is much to the displeasure of the founders of the modern Olympic movement, and that's the title of my talk, Unwanted Companions, the Olympics and Politics. The modern Olympics were founded by an idealistic Frenchman named Pierre de Coubertin in the late 1800s, and he dreamed of increasing sport and fitness in his native France and believed that international competition would be the best way to do so, and certainly had peaceful intentions from the start. He had seen the ugly side of humanity in the 1870s in the Franco-Prussian War and believed that sports could be a vehicle to create sort of a brotherhood amongst nations to avoid future conflict. As he was planning this Olympic Games, he famously stated, "Let us export our oarsmen, our fencers, our runners into foreign lands, for that is the true free trade of the future. And the day that it is introduced into Europe, the cause of peace will have a new and strong ally." The cause of peace will have a new and strong ally. Pretty lofty stuff for a sporting competition which has no history, hasn't started yet. And it is in that spirit that the Games began in 1896 in Athens, and the first several Olympic Games really went off without much political interference. 1900 in Paris, 1904 in St. Louis, 1908 in London, 1912 in Stockholm, Sweden. Our first intersection of the Olympics and politics takes place 1916, World War II, ravaging Europe, causes the cancellation of the Games. We fast forward 20 years further, 1936, Hitler's Games. The Games are in Berlin. Okay, also the Olympic Games of Louis Zamperini of Unbroken, which you read last year. This was Hitler's way of using his Nazi propaganda to show the world his rebuilt Germany after World War I, and also show the superiority of his Aryan race. So we have this harsh image, okay, the Olympic torch, this symbol of goodwill, okay, surrounded by this Nazi propaganda as the flame enters the stadium in 1936. Also, we have this also jarring image, Jesse Owens atop the medal stand, flanked by Germans in the famous Hail Hitler pose, arms outstretched, okay, saluting the Fuhrer during the national anthem. Of course, it would only be 3 years later that Hitler would plunge the world into war again in the breakout of World War II in 1939, causing the cancellation of the 1940 and 44 Games. Our next intersection of politics and Olympics takes place in the pool, Melbourne, Australia, 1956. Hungary and the Soviet Union are set to collide in a semifinal water polo match. At this time, 1950s, Eastern Europe is all under the harsh rule and control of the Soviet Union, okay, behind the Iron Curtain. 2 months prior to the games, in the summer of '56, Soviet tanks had rolled through Budapest and Hungary, quelching the Hungarian Revolution, which was seeking independence from the Soviet influence. Hungarian citizens were killed in that rebellion as the tanks rolled through town, and it was with sort of heavy hearts and all this on their mind that the Hungarians take to the pool for that contest against the hated Soviets. They talked about the CCP on the Soviet uniforms being the same CCP they saw on the tanks that summer. And water polo, as we know, is a contact sport, and pushing and pulling escalates into punches, and violence erupts during the game. It got so bad that the officials had to stop the game due to the amount of blood in the water. Hungary did win the game 4-0, but here we see the Hungarian athlete leaving the pool deck, blood streaming down his face. This is certainly not the peaceful games that Kublai Khan had dreamt about 60 years earlier. Moving ahead to the 1960s, equity and diversity issues take center stage in the Olympic arena. In 1960, the International Olympic Committee banned South Africa from competing in the Games due to its policy of apartheid. The government sanctioned segregation of its white and black citizens. That ban would stick until 1992. And famously, in 1968, John Carlos and Tommie Smith, in the height of the American Civil Rights Movement, make their salute to black power atop the medal stand. Citing a breach of the Olympic spirit, the United States Olympic team and the Olympic Committee swiftly removed the men from the team. They're sent home early, and shamed for sort of this outward expression of personal politics within the Olympic arena. 4 years later, terrorism and Mideast tensions come to Munich in 1972. Israel, still a relatively young country, only formed in 1947, sends a small delegation to the Games in Germany. Lax security in the Olympic Village allows members of a Palestinian terrorist group, Black September, to gain access to the dormitories, and they kidnap several members of the Israeli team. Here's a photo of one of the kidnappers on the porch in the Olympic Village. The terrorists are demanding release of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and negotiations break down, and a botched rescue effort leaves all Israeli athletes dead. This is really the low point of modern Olympic history in terms of these athletes came to the Games in the spirit of peace and friendship, and end up not making it out alive. Certainly, 40 years later, you'd like to think that tensions have relieved, but you only need to look to the most recent headlines out of Gaza to realize that tensions are still very much raw and fresh in the Mideast. Moving further down, 4 years later, the Games moved to North America in Montreal. And Canada makes political headlines, by failing to allow the delegation from Taiwan, to compete in the Games. They don't issue them visas to enter Canada to compete because Taiwan wants to compete under the name the Republic of China. This highlights the fact that sort of at this point in Asian history, two countries are really vying for the name of China, the Communist People's Republic of China, and what's now Taiwan, the Republic of China. So mild-mannered Canada, typically sort of on the fringe of world affairs, makes a statement not allowing Taiwan to take part in their games. Ironically, the People's Republic of China, sort of the Olympic power, finishing second in the medal race in London 2012, because of all this sort of political infighting, they weren't allowed to compete in the Games until 1980. So in all that short time, they've really come up through the ranks in the medal count. The Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. As a child of the 80s, this is very much part of my own personal history, and really the height of political entanglement in terms of the Olympic Games. The 1980 Games were scheduled to take place in Moscow, Soviet Union. And President Carter, as a result of the recent Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, decides to boycott the Games. Certainly a strong statement politically around the world as 65 other countries join in this boycott of the Moscow Games. But imagine if you're one of those American athletes who had trained their whole life, for that one moment, your time is robbed. This is an era in the Olympics where you really only had one window to compete. It wasn't sort of professionals now where they're competing in several games. 4 years later, 1984, the first Olympic Games that I remember, okay, in Los Angeles, the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies retaliate with their own boycott in 1984 by refusing to enter the country and retaliating for 1980. And while you may think that the most recent Olympic Games have been relatively lean on political interference, okay, in 2008 in Beijing, several groups protested due to China's human rights infractions. And most recently, this summer in London 2012, the North Korean soccer team walked off the field as a result of the wrong flag, the South Korean flag being shown on the Jumbotron in pregame warm-ups. So clearly politics and Olympics, okay, still very much at play here. So did the Coubertin fail? Did the Olympics really increase tensions and conflict among nations? Certainly there are several examples that would cite that, but I do think he'd be proud of the thousands of Olympic athletes that have competed over the century in the name of friendship, sportsmanship, and peace and goodwill. I think he'd be proud of Oscar Pistorius, the Blade Runner from South Africa, the first double amputee to compete against able-bodied runners in the Olympic Games, and his inspiring story. I also think he'd be proud of Tamina Kohistani from Afghanistan, the first track athlete to compete for native Afghanistan, breaking down gender barriers within that country. And so, looking back with that sort of Olympic junkie spirit of the 1988, I'm optimistic for the future of the Olympic Games. I do believe there's a chance for that vehicle of peace that de Coubertin dreamt of to be still realized. But history tells us that when 200 countries come together for a friendly competition, nationalism, propaganda, and politics have a way of rearing its ugly head. See you in Rio 2016. Thank you.